Hi everybody, and welcome to the latest of our Gaa Coach Webinar Series. Apologies for the slight delay in getting started. Tonight's session is a really interesting and really timely one, and our presenter is Eamon O Reilly. So Eamon is a chartered physiotherapist and clinical lead of Spark in South Dublin. He has worked with a number of inter-county teams in hurling and football, and he has worked with the Dublin Hurlers since 2011. He's has been a physio for the Irish International Rules team on 3 different series. He has also been involved in physiotherapy services for the Irish high performance boxing squads. So Eamon is also currently on the National GA Medical Scientific and Welfare Committee, and he's a sports science he also sits in the sports science expert group for the GA. So his main clinical areas of expertise are involved in complex chronic athletic injuries around the hip, including recurrent hamstring, abdominal and hip or groin injuries. So Eamon's session tonight, as I said, is a really topical one for us right now. So the topic title is Returning to Gaelic Games Post-COVID, Keeping Your Squad Fit and Preventing Injury. So we're going to look at some of the issues facing GA players currently and how we might look to address them. We're looking at return to play post-COVID and how we can mitigate for time out of play through injury and so on. So Eamon will also look at specific ways of tailoring training to avoid injuries as we progress from perhaps small group to maybe more larger group sessions later on. We'll also discuss injury prevention and recovery and that you can use with your players during the condensed playing calendar. So Eamon, there's a lot to cover and I'm sure everyone is really interested in your session, so it's over to you.
Thanks very much, Peter, and thanks for the invite on tonight. It's been a fantastic series so far, so well done to you and all the team that's put this together. And so thank you for everyone for tuning in tonight. I hope you get something out of this in terms of our session. So what we're looking at tonight really is a number of different things, bringing us right from today, right the way through into return to play, hopefully whenever that is. Obviously at the time period we're in at the moment, we don't know exactly when that will be, but I guess we've got to prep our athletes for that. So that's going to be really important over the coming weeks. So we're going to look at individual training. We're going to look at return to play post-COVID and what we have to look out for around that. We're going to look at specific strategies that we can use for individual prep and obviously warm-up, which is a key part. We're going to look at specific injury avoidance. We're going to look at running, speed, mechanics and conditioning, return to play post-injury, what are the risks, and hopefully we'll have time for some questions at the end. So just to give you a bit of background on myself, I am obviously a physio. I also would class myself as a player, although there's probably some people even on this call that would dispute that. I'm a coach. I'm also on the MSW. I come from County Cavan and I guess a small club in County Cavan, and I'm now with Ballyboden St Enda's, and that's my club now for the last 6 years. So I kind of know a little bit about small club and also a slightly bigger club in Ballyboden as well. So hopefully I'm going to be able to pitch this to coaches for pretty much all the way through, and also obviously for anyone from a medical background coming in tonight's session. So in terms of current issues, what we're kind of looking at the moment from this period, and obviously the 7-8 weeks that we've had beforehand, we're seeing a lot of shin, ankle, Achilles and calf injuries coming through clinics. We're seeing a lot of people out on the road obviously getting their running in. We're seeing obviously a lack of football, hurling and camogie. So essentially that means that we're going to enter pre-season 2 now. So the players have quite a long off season. For most players, this will be longer than they've ever had off before. So we've got to factor that in terms of how we're going to bring guys back to that first day of championship, whenever that may be. So the pre-season length is obviously a problem because we don't know how long that is actually going to be. It's going to differ from county to county. And obviously we've got to master that transition into playing. So looking at our kind of setup, it's going to be individual training. That's probably, started already in terms of, what guys have been at and what they've been at prior to this. So if we look at that from the point of view of, short sessions out on the road up to, kind of pitch sessions now that they might be doing, it's been pretty unstructured for a lot of guys, and some guys are going to come into a little bit of an off season now. We're going to look at small group training, then that's going to come in next based on government guidelines, followed by team training, and then probably quickly in the championship after that. With the shortened schedule, you're going to probably see minimal time between games, And depending on your county, that could be very minimal. If you're a dual county, for instance, we don't know what kind of setup or what kind of timeline we're going to have in order for guys to get ready for a dual championship. So in terms of current issues and opportunities, so if we look at this, I guess a lot of you guys may have seen this 5K post by Ross Barkley. It was very much questioned by the Chelsea fans who claim to have never seen him run more than 5K in a game. So we've seen a lot of these going up recently around Ireland. Lots of guys posting unbelievable times, and some may be true, but I would question a lot of them. And I suppose this is the type of training that's been happening. So with that, as I said, you're looking at these kind of calf type issues, Achilles tendon issues, tib post tendon issues, and also stress injuries around the foot. So before we even start, we've got to start looking at cleaning these injuries up and making sure that your players are ready to come into play when that time arises. So it's probably worth checking in with those guys at the moment and just seeing how they're getting on with things and making sure that they are ready to return to small group training whenever that may be. We also see knee issues, patellofemoral issues in particular, and that's from basically pounding the roads. So at the moment, we've got an opportunity, a massive opportunity, you could say, in terms of getting our players ready to return to play. We've got X amount of time now to really get on top of all this type of stuff. We've got another pre-season time period where we can really get on top of the other, I suppose, football or hurling or camogie related issues that we may have to deal with following a long absence from play. We do have lessons.
Eamon, sorry, can I jump in for 1 second? I'm not sure your slides are going forward for everybody. So will you just cancel the share and reshare, and I can try and put them back up again for everybody? It just seems like the slides are frozen. Yeah, that's better.
Better?
We can see the current slide. It seems Teams has been acting up for the last 24 hours or so. So I can see the current slide, the NFL player, and so on.
Sure.
But yeah, maybe if you can just work away, and if it's still happening, I can come back into you.
Sure, no problem. So in terms of the NFL lockout of 2011, this was basically a player contract issue. And it does teach us some lessons from the past. So the timeline was very similar, March to August, along the same timeline that we have. The preseason was condensed. It went from 12 to 14 weeks down to 17 days. Achilles tendons ruptures in this time period were fourfold. So that increased the obviously injured list massively, given the time out of play associated with Achilles tendon ruptures. We also saw a massive difference in terms of the types of players that were getting these issues. Veterans are normally the ones that come out with these issues, whereas in this time period it was mainly rookies. And there were a number of factors that may lead to that. There was also an increase in injury recurrence. Why? Well, the study by Greg Meyer and his team basically looked at all of this, and their findings were similar to what we're going to see over the next few months. So there was a long period of time out of play, and there was also, I suppose, no contact with their organization, whether that's with the medical team, the S&C team, or the management team. So the lads were kind of let off to their own devices, which obviously left them with a lot more, I suppose, uncharted or uncontrolled training methods, and this may have led to increased ruptures of the Achilles tendon. We also know that obviously going from a 12 to 14 weeks preseason right down to 17 days is going to make a massive difference in terms of the ability or how prepared athletes are to play. So it's really important that we acknowledge now that we're not going to maybe have the same type of season that we always had, and we have to adjust as coaches. We have to adjust how we're going to actually interact with our players and also how we're going to plan our sessions. I suggest starting with the end in mind. So what do you want from your players on game one championship? Most guys are going to want the same thing, whether you're playing junior F, hurling, right the way up to, you know, adult club football. this whole presentation is probably geared more towards the club season, given that a lot of the coaches are going to, on this call, are going to be in that category. So we want injury-free players. That's number one. We know that there's links with injury-free teams and championship winning teams. So that's a big thing for us. We need them physically fit, and we have to do that by whatever means we can in whatever time period we have. We need them sharp. Ball skills absolutely vital. Hurl time is very, very important. So getting on the ball at this time period also really, really important. And we want them hungry. To be honest, if a guy isn't hungry after this length of time out, or a girl isn't hungry after this time out, I don't know if they'll ever be hungry. So I think that should be taken as a given, that we're going to have hungry players dying to get back on that pitch whenever the time comes for that. Start with the end in mind. So what do you want from your players on game one championship? So you need to know what your players are going to have to be able to do when you come to championship time. What I mean by that is specifically related to your own game plan in terms of your team and how you want to play the game. The picture in the background there shows 2 Leicester City players. We know Leicester City obviously won the Premiership in 2016, and there was some interesting statistics behind all of that. They had the fewest injuries in that season, to use the fewest players in that season. We also see that they had the fastest players in that year. So if we look at Vardy and Schlupp, like, those guys are really motoring when you're hitting over 35 kilometers per hour. That's extremely quick.
Eamon, I'll interrupt again. Sorry, I'm not sure it was working. I think I'm in control of the slides now. I've used the version you sent me. So if you just want to tell me to move forward the slides when you're ready, and I'll do that for you.
Yeah. So looking at the counter-attacking style that Ranieri basically brought into Leicester City at that time period, obviously with that he was looking for extremely quick breaks, and therefore his training had to map out to that. So if your team is looking to play that sort of system in Gaelic football or hurling or camogie, then you've got to really look at, I suppose, sprint and speed and repeated sprint ability being a key part of that. Klopp, on the other hand, was brought into Liverpool in October of 2017, I think it was, and we saw straight away when he came in that his style of play was a gegenpress style, where there was a lot of pressure on the from the forwards on opposing defenders, and obviously with this brought a new, I suppose, increase in terms of load that the players are expected to undertake. So we ended up with a lot of injuries with this Liverpool team, and I guess at that time period, you know, that probably impacted massively on their success at the start. Once Klopp had implemented his methods and got his, I suppose, his end in mind, we're seeing the results of that now when we're looking at Liverpool 25 points clear in Premiership. So you're looking at your own team to see what type of game you're going to play, and obviously your training needs to map out to that in order for you to avoid injuries, because you want the tolerance or the bandwidth of the player to be increased massively in order for them to be able to withstand whatever style of play you're going to implement. Coming back specifically to GAA, we know from the data we do have that acute injuries are three times more likely to occur than chronic injuries. Non-contact, 2.8 times more likely than contact. What we see is quad injuries, 9.3%, knee, 11.1%, ankle, 11.7%, and then the big two, groin at 14.9%, and hamstring at 23%. What we see with that is, you know, I suppose our focus areas for injury prevention around the lower limbs specifically. A lot of the injuries we sustain in GAA are lower limb injuries. Obviously with hurling we see more hands and sometimes shoulders, you know, in terms of hand fractures, etc. But mostly GAA players, this is what the research we have isn't, I suppose, massively complete, and we definitely need to do more as medical teams in terms of contributing to the national database on this, and hopefully that's something we can make some ground with over the next couple of years in terms of making it really consistent across all teams, like it is in the NFL, like it is in the AFL. But this is the best data that we have in terms of our GAA injuries at the moment. We also have some other injury data, which you can check out on my Twitter there. I just didn't have enough time for the slides, on adolescent players. So that's also there. You can check it out. It should be up there now. So what we do know, sports injuries compromise team success. Inappropriately prescribed training load can lead to injury. So that's on us as coaches. Increasing training load too quickly can lead to large increases in injury. This is a study in 2016 by Tim Gabbett, and a weekly increase of 50% in training load leads to a 38% increase in injury. So if we've got a shortened season, or if we've got a really decreased timeline in terms of our training start date to the start of our first championship game, losing a guy or two guys or three guys, or up to 38% of your squad would be huge. Well, you're never going to lose that much, but even losing 3, 4, 5 guys is a lot of injuries to pick up in that time period. So really getting our load right, and I'm sure a lot of you guys have looked at Tim Gabbett's work on how to bring guys up in terms of incrementally increasing their training load. And this also works the other way. So if you're not training the guys to a proper level, or getting them up to a good enough level in terms of their training load, and they're basically going to be underprepared for competition. So we've got to be really careful about making sure that we're able to meet the demands of the game. And I guess in order to do that, we've got to know the demands of our game. And that really comes down to us as coaches to know, A, what we're looking at normally, and B, what we need from our players in our own individual setup. So for instance, at inter-county level at the moment, in terms of hurling, you're probably looking at 700 to 1.2 kilometers of high-speed running per game. Most guys probably falling below a kilometer, whereas football might be slightly higher. So you've got to know kind of the demands of the game that you're playing, and really being able to prepare the athlete accordingly for that. And what do we need to do as coaches? Well, we need to prepare the athlete for competition. We need to make the athlete as robust as possible and give them the best chance to perform. And we need to pitch it correctly. So that's really important. It's getting that pitch right from today, which is individual training, to small group training, to larger group training, and then obviously into our championship time period. So our issues at the start of return to play for small groups, a lot of the time we're going to see a lot of guys coming back into our setups now, or into mini groups whenever that happens, whether if it's June the 8th or whatever date we're given for that. Straight line has been the main training focus over the last time period. We're looking at a lot of guys doing the 5Ks, 10Ks, a lot of straight line running. I see it myself when I go down to the local park here. You see a lot of straight line work going on, a lot of guys doing MAS type running. The speed of running is also a lot slower, so we've got to pitch our players right in terms of transitioning to smaller group training. So going from a really slow pace into maximal small box type drills is not really going to work out for your players. We're going to pick up a lot of injuries as a result. The surface is also changing. We're going from concrete or tar onto grass, and obviously there comes the injuries that we could have picked up previously that may be adding to the load of that player, in terms of shin, in terms of stress injuries of the feet from, say, the tar macadam running or whatever else. And obviously we're looking at small-sided gains. So we're looking at smaller groups, therefore the gains are not going to be fuller. We have to watch out how we're going to pitch our small-sided gains. We need to know some of the work that Shane Mangan would have went through there a couple of weeks ago in terms of what you're looking to do in a small-sided game, and how the pitch size and how the pitch or the player numbers are going to impact on that. So obviously bigger pitches are going to mean more conditioning if you've got smaller numbers, whereas if you've got a large number of players in a smaller space, that's going to involve a lot more twist turning, change of direction type drills. And that's going to lead obviously to, I suppose, more stress and strain on things like your hips and groins. So we decrease our injury risk by incrementally loading and the training type and the speed. So that's really important, I guess. In this initial period, we're looking to build up that conditioning base, and the important thing in this period is we can definitely use the ball to do that. you know, whether it's a larger pitch with smaller numbers, you're probably not looking to go into that max speed effort type scenario because the player hasn't been there for so long. You've got to build up to that point. Really important to have recovery pre and post session. The most important thing around recovery, I guess, is allowing an athlete to be ready to train and allow an athlete to be ready to play. So that's giving them the best chance to perform on a given Sunday or a given Tuesday or Thursday night. And then we've got to use the various training modalities wisely in terms of those small groups. So really making sure that we're not just training straight line now for the next month in terms of conditioning. We've got to look offline a little bit in terms of, you know, our multi-directional work, in terms of our curb running, in terms of everything else that basically makes us GA players. And so we've got to train the end with the end in mind, essentially, but slowly bringing us up that curve. Return to play then in the larger group. So it changes a little bit, I suppose, when we go to that. So we've got some risk factors at that point, in that there's a lack of time pre-competition. There is a lack of match play on the player's behalf, and lack of fitness, obviously. So in terms of that, what can we do? We can help the lads out by starting the conditioning work now. There is some conditioning work that you can do individually, and obviously soon enough we'll be able to get into those small groups. The sooner you kind of get started on some of this stuff, the more seamless the transition is across, and the less cramming you're doing at the end. And again, I mentioned it earlier on in terms of that multi-directional conditioning. That's extremely important in terms of preparing the athlete for play in a multi-directional field sport. And I suppose most importantly, for a coach, it's most important that we don't try and do it all. So we know that this gap is going to be short, and we know that we've got so much work that we generally put into a season. It's not viable, or it's not really going to happen that you're going to be having the perfect, I suppose, training plan and the perfect pitch into championship this year in terms of how you would normally do it as a coach. So making sure that we're able to, I suppose, get the key components in and do essentially the best we can through accurate planning, and really, really looking at, I suppose, how you can make that player as good as is possible in terms of those 4 key components that we need on that first championship day. And that's going to be really, really important, and you have to really work on that. And then we've got this other group, the return to play post-injury. So that type of player is the guy that maybe has not really been involved in the first half of the season that we had, or the 1 or 2 games or whatever you had, and potentially was out from an injury from last season, or picked up an injury early on this year. These guys we have to be really touching base with at the moment. From the NFL lockout, we saw that the guys that were injured previously had recurring injuries taking place at this time point. So coming back into play, they had a lot more of this injury recurrence. So a hamstring issue popping its ugly head up again, or a calf issue or whatever else. We have to make sure that we're looking after, I suppose, the injury in terms of adequate rehabilitation. And we have to make sure that as a coach that we're encouraging these guys to get back at it. Biggest risk factor for future injury is obviously previous injury. So making sure that, you know, we're basically bulletproofing the athlete for play starts really right now. If you've got guys that maybe are in that category, it's probably worth, you know, giving them a call this evening, or giving that lady a shout this evening, and just seeing where they're at with things. At this time point, a lot of athletes have maybe fallen off the wagon a little bit in terms of their GA, and, you know, haven't really been thinking that much about it because there's, you know, no end date in sight. But we've got to use the opportunity that we've been presented with in terms of making sure that these athletes are coming back in the best possible health. And we saw in the NFL lockout that poor rehabilitation took place due to access. So access to, you know, your local physio, or access to, you know, the facility to train in, or access to the gym, whatever it may be, you know. And obviously the current situation, you know, tends to leave players just maybe drifting a little bit. And I think it's really important that we look at addressing that with our players at the moment. And often you hear, well, you know what, I'm going to be out now for the next 6 weeks anyway, sure, I'll just rest it. That's going to be the answer to this. If you have a chronic overload issue, rest will not be the answer. Often we're looking at biomechanical deficits that have led to that overload injury, and it's really important that they're addressed in order to prevent the injury from happening again. If you don't address these biomechanical deficits, once you come back into that first couple of weeks of training, the shock to the system is bad enough without having an underlying issue to deal with as well, which is obviously going to worsen the situation. And we need to ensure that all the boxes are getting ticked before return to play. And by that, I mean, you need to bring your players, or make sure that your players are going through, I suppose, all the various components of rehabilitation and that makes them a GAA player. So we're looking at strength control, reactive strength, making sure they're getting the running volume, making sure they're getting the running speed, and all the other return to play markers that we have. The speed vaccine is an interesting concept. It was first, I suppose, heard the term being coined at a conference a number of years back. It's based on some work by Shane Malone, and basically sprinting can play a key role in injury prevention. So a number of studies have looked at this, and particularly Shane has looked at this in the GA and in the intra-county game. By developing lower body strength, repeat sprint ability and speed, this increases tolerance to workload and reduces injuries. By getting all these factors in place and getting all these components really spot on, then you're creating an increased low tolerance for that individual, for that athlete. So the bandwidth is bigger, therefore their ability to withstand the demands of the game increases. However, at this current time point, you've got to be careful with this, because obviously you can't just start sprinting guys next week or the week after. You've got to develop that bandwidth over a period of time, and that's really important. Under and overexposure of a player to maximal velocity events increases the risk of injuries. So that's what the study told us. Basically, if you undercook the players, when they go back on the pitch, they're not going to be ready for action. You know, they're not going to be exposed to those high sprint levels. The only way you could work something like that is if you ask the cornerback not to sprint out after that ball. Good luck with that one. If you're looking at overexposure, you're basically looking at giving the players too much of this maximal sprint and maximal velocity events. And obviously with fatigue or with, you know, the timing of that, you know, you can increase the risk of how that athlete is exposed to injuries, specifically around the hamstring. That's probably the main muscle group, although obviously more muscle groups come into that as well. Nice phrase that Shane has coined is use it or lose it, but don't abuse it. So I guess that really comes true in terms of our ability to sprint, and it also really shows us that we've got to make sure that we're looking after the athlete and looking after their body as we're going through the next number of months. So the big question is then, when to sprint? Do you sprint at the start of a session, or do you sprint at the end of a session? I listened to Dr. Damien Young's talk a number of weeks back, where he spoke about the Tipperary hurlers implementing a sprint under fatigue, you know, program. I guess a big thing with that would be, I would love to ask Dr. Young where in the season they pitch that in at. And for me, I suppose I would not like to be doing that without that bandwidth being developed really, really well, you know, coming into championship. Essentially, I think you'd be rolling the dice to do that on the Thursday night before a big game. However, the flip side of that, and this is probably where he was coming from, was if you're in the Leicester City camp where you've really worked on this over a long period of time, then you can get those guys sprinting like Leicester did on a Thursday under fatigue to get them up to that level. So realistically, it's all about timing, and it's all about their ability to withstand the load. And at the moment, coming off the back of a 12-week layoff or a 10-week layoff, whatever it may be, you've got to wonder, would our athletes be ready for end of session sprinting? For myself, I suppose a lot of the coaching I would have done, I would implement this type of warm-up at the end, or this type of training at the end of a warm-up. So what we've done here in Ballyboden St. End is, as much as possible, we've got our coaches trying to undertake the warm-up we're going to discuss in a second, and also adding in these sprints at the end of our warm-up to really, I suppose, engage that athlete on a weekly basis and expose them to that maximal, or, you know, close to maximal sprint speed. In terms of our pre-season versus pre-championship, if we look at it from a pre-season point of view, small groups at the moment, coming straight back in, that's not our time period for going for maximal sprint work. For our pre-championship work, I guess that's definitely going to have to come in there somewhere. You know, I wouldn't have any issues with guys sprinting on a Tuesday night, you know, before a match on a Sunday. You know, once that the guys are coming into that session, like we spoke about before, in terms of well recovered coming into that session, and some of the other factors that we're going to discuss later on in relation to hamstring injuries. How often to expose? I guess we're probably looking at 7 to 10 days that we're looking for that rolling maximal velocity effort within that time period, and trying to build the guys up all the time with that. So over this course of the season, you might see guys, you know, not that quick in say November time, and then they're approaching top speed as they come on in the year. I guess a little bit of that too will be got to do with the type of surface that you're looking at. Obviously softer ground in the winter, and also the harder ground in the summer. So when you end up in a situation where you've got a lot of lads, you know, training potentially on 2 different surfaces in the winter, where you've got astro or potentially a, you know, boggy grass pitch, and you've got this kind of to and fro between 2 pitches, that obviously exposes the athlete to greater injury risk. So we need to find the optimal amount of high-speed running. This is going back to our point previously regarding our GPS data that we can use as inter-county setups, in terms of looking at the data of what we require of our players. Obviously at club level, there's not too many clubs that will have access to this type of, you know, I suppose, technology. And for you guys, you know, it's just about better planning and implementation of your session, knowing what you're going to do and what are the expected outcomes of that in terms of high-speed running, or if you're doing specific running drills, then you're going to obviously know the distance and you're going to be able to pitch it at a level suitable to that player. And we need to condition it. So we need to build up to that. And we also need to, you know, I suppose, bring our players up to that point where they're getting that regular input of this type of work in terms of the game-based approach to this. So what I mean by that is that, you know, you're looking at bringing this sprint-based training in through your training sessions. So it doesn't have to be side of the pitch, we're going to run these guys, so on and so forth. You can definitely, with some really good thinking, think about how you're going to get your running into your session with your ball or with the slitter. And we're looking to avoid overloading the athletes too quickly. That's really important. Movement variability obviously is very important, and basically we're talking about looking at all the various factors we've discussed previously in terms of multi-directional work, in terms of deceleration, acceleration, change of direction, whatever else, you know, that's really important. And we need those max speed exposures as we discussed. So what about small-sided games? Well, I think it's really important that, you know, we refer back to some of the previous speakers in terms of the pitch size and what that will happen, what will happen with that in terms of the goals of the session. So bigger pitches are going to lead to more fitness type work if you've got small numbers on that pitch. Smaller pitch based work with bigger numbers, a lot more contact, a lot more tackling. That type of work, especially in these small group situations that we're going to have over the coming weeks, you have to be careful with that. We know that these guys are coming off the back of no contact whatsoever, probably going to have a period of no contact at the start anyway, and then building into contact. But we've got to make sure that we're not exposing them to increased risk of hip and groin injuries as we're going through that time period. So the positives obviously of small-sided games are increased ball contacts, change of direction, accelerations, decelerations. You can also obviously get a lot of, you know, I suppose fitness work done with bigger pitches. And when small-sided games are well designed, they can match the demands of Gaelic football. Jason McGann's research tells us that. And then obviously you have to think about the differences in terms of hamstring activation and fatigue between those kind of acceleration, deceleration type movements and obviously max speed movements. And obviously you've got to take into account what's happening in the hamstring, you know, what we're asking it to do when we're going into bigger games where there's more, you know, bigger space games where there's more, I suppose, exposure to fatigue. And we know from some previous research by Madison et al. That these guys are basically more at risk of developing hamstring injuries in that environment because of the fatigue element associated with that type of game. We know we're going to be doing these games over the next number of weeks. It's just really about planning well for these types of games. And then obviously I mentioned the increased forces through the hip and groin. This is a massive area in the GA at the moment, and it's definitely something that we're already looking at on the MSW. Hip and groin injuries hugely increased over the last 15, 20 years, and getting on top of that is going to be a key I suppose, objective of the Medical Scientific Welfare Committee over the next number of years. The big thing with the small sided gains is making sure that we're not exposing guys to too small a gain. So that's the maybe box drills on a much too regular basis, or it's the, I suppose, high intensity twisting and turning type, tackle drills that we may be implementing in our practice. Also, obviously, what comes into that, just slightly off the small sided game issue, is the shuttle type running, and all of this will lead to increased force through our hip and groin. And that's also very similar for our ankle and knee, but the hip and groin is the one where we're seeing, I suppose, a lot more injuries with this type of training. And it's not that small-sided gains are bad at all. It's certainly not that. Small-sided gains are a vital part of our coaching. A big thing is just planning well on when you're going to do the really smaller type gains and the surface you're going to do that on, and then when you're going to do the bigger type, more expansive type gains. And I guess at the start, I would suggest that maybe looking at those more expansive type gains is a great way of getting our conditioning up to speed. The speed of those drills may not be as high as you would have maybe in other type drills, because of the fatigue element. Guys are not going to be able to, I suppose, really push on as that gain goes on. And so that could be a way of looking at our early training in the next number of weeks. Next thing I want to speak about is warm-up, and it's something that every single person on this call no doubt has done with their team, and it's something that we really need to tidy up on within GA. And I think as I go through this, you'll see why. Why are we doing warm-ups? Well, we're doing it to maximize player availability. We're doing it to decrease preventable injuries, and we'll speak about that in a second. And this is the big one. Warm-ups have been shown to increase athlete performance. And we're looking for an improved consistency of approach, and specifically related to decreasing injuries I'm talking about here. So a lot of times I talk to coaches, and coaches who are looking at this type of training will probably say to me, I'm not really sure about this, it takes too long to do. So the injury, I'm talking specifically around the GA 15 and the Activate warm-up. Coaches find this obviously too long, not enough ball involved in it, and they are not sure if they can devote some of their session time to this. I suppose the counter argument to that is the evidence I'm about to present to you shows why you're going to have more players on the pitch if you implement this type of warm-up. Physical competency in terms of running, change of direction, landing, jumping, twisting, turning, that's fundamental to the game of Gaelic gains. We have to do that literally all the way through a 60 or 70-minute match. Therefore, it deserves a time slot within a given time, within a given training session or training block, for instance. And the best way to do that is implementing it with our athletes at the start of the session. We know that there's some associated benefits with this type of thing, and we know that there are, decreased risks of injury post doing them within that given session. So I don't understand why you couldn't devote that time period to it if you haven't already been doing it. I understand that you can do stuff with the ball, but specifically training these skills, because they are essentially skills, they're physical competency skills, is going to make your athlete better. Whether you're up here in Dublin, obviously the argument will be, listen, I've only got an hour on whatever time slot on whatever pitch I'm going on to, therefore I can't give away time to this. There's not too many pitches around that doesn't have a side area where you can start this 10 minutes before your time slot is due to start and get on with it. Down the country where there's lots of space, there's definitely no excuse for not implementing these warm-ups, and you'll see why in a second. But is it all positive? So compliance is definitely an issue with this. Cherry picking of exercises is definitely an issue with this. So if you're missing some of these components, such as landing, cutting, running skills, then that's going to lead to an increased risk of injury. When we look at it, if you've got a juvenile section and a team under your control, you're looking after them, you've got a massive opportunity to give these athletes or these young athletes skills that they're going to bring on into their adult career. And it's really, it comes down to the detail, and it's probably something we need to talk about it from a coaching perspective in terms of our overall coaching plan within the GA, in terms of showing our coaches how to, I suppose, undertake these and execute these and see where the gaps are in terms of, multi-directional movement, or see where the gaps are in landing competency, or see where the gaps are in running mechanics, for instance. We know, especially with something like an ACL, which is a huge time loss injury, that a lot of our athletes are getting these injuries through non-contact. So that's also, that's often as a result of, poor control of a land, or an externally rotated foot on cutting, or whatever else. There's lots of various biomechanical factors that can lead to us being in a situation where our ACL is exposed to injury. Therefore, I think it's really, really important that, our coaches really look at this, and this is why. So the FIFA 11 Plus is where all of this information has originally come from, and I guess the GA 15 and also the Activate Ulster Cancer warm-up are essentially versions of this, to a GA specific, group. What we see with the FIFA 11 Plus, and this is a huge study by Holly Silvers, was a decrease in overall injury risk, or injuries, not injury risk. This is a decrease in overall injuries by 46.1%. That is absolutely huge. A decrease in time loss by 28.6%. When we start looking specifically at joints and at muscles, a 64% decrease in hamstring issues. Now, if we're coming into the next number of weeks, and we're talking about this type of deficit in terms of decreasing our injury risk or our injury profile by that much, it's really not within your interest not to be implementing a warm-up such as the GA15 or Activate. Now, I do recognize you see lots of variations of, I suppose, warm-ups on both the soccer pitch and also in, inter-county setups. I guess what I would say about that is that we're looking at very highly skilled strength and conditioning coaches, and 9 times out of 10 you're going to see that type of warm-up taking place potentially somewhere not on the pitch, but somewhere off in the back pitch. I remember having a Twitter debate with someone a number of months back over the Barcelona warm-up, which seemed to be just literally a kickabout. I know you often go out and you look at the Kilkenny warm-up where they're pucking the ball across the pitch. That's been brought up to me on several occasions. But I guarantee you those guys are getting through some work in terms of the components of something like the FIFA 11 Plus. And then ACL injuries, 76.5% decrease. Now, this isn't the only study, the Holly Silver study. There's also a couple of other studies that have looked at this. I've put 2 other studies up on my Twitter again. So there's a study by Thorborg et al. Which looked and it found similar, I suppose, results to Holly Silver study. And there's also a small study on GA players which really looked at hurling, and it also found a 45% decrease in injury risk, which is, again, it's really, really huge in terms of what we can give players in a 10-minute slot. So in terms of our components of this type of warm-up, the GA and 15 and Activate really are the warm-ups we're talking about. As I said, they're based on the 11 Plus. The section 1 that you're seeing there really is looking, this is the GA 15's one, you're looking at the running side of things here. The section F on the right hand side there is the second half of this. The Activate is similar enough, except the Activate probably incorporates a few more of the section below the section 1 there, the lunge type stuff, the jump type stuff within the actual warm-up, and you run through the phases. Now, there is one caveat I would say, and it's timing of execution of exercises. I would not agree with sticking a Nordic curl in the night before or before a match. The Nordic curl, something like that, is going to, yes, it can decrease your injury risk as shown by the study by Pedersen et al. But if you throw that in before you're going out in the pitch, the Nordic curl is a fairly high intensity hamstring exercise. So if you're exposing your players to that before or the night before a training session, then you're going to put them athletes at risk. If you want to bring this into, say, your schedule on a regular basis, or another hamstring exercise, strength exercise, which there are many of, you know, that the time period for doing that is probably after a session or on a day where there's no session the next day. And then we're looking at individual strategies to address the pre-warm-up. Individual prep, this is pretty much called an inter-county setup. And basically we're looking at any number of, I suppose, individual exercises within an athlete's, I suppose, injury profile. So you can see the top one is maybe one for the shoulder. The bottom one is one which is me showing per running technique with the first one where I fall off to the side, and the second one where I've got really good hip contraction where I'm staying nice and tall and I'm getting right through and just landing straight on. So that's a run mechanics one. So I probably wouldn't say I would be prescriptive with this. I think a lot of athletes are, you know, already, especially the ones that are really tuned in and are really looking to push on or have had previous injuries. These guys are, you know, already implementing their own pre-warm-up, and it's just activating muscles. It's just getting things ready to go for that warm-up before you go out on the pitch or whatever else. And as I say, run mechanics really important to integrate into every warm-up, and basically the GA15 and Activate really give us the opportunity to do this. And I would integrate multi-directional mechanics into every session. If you don't have any, I suppose, access to, you know, a coaching of a good enough level to do that, just get online. There's lots of different resources there, you know, that you can look at. Ian Jeffries, for instance, is one guy who's into this, and there's a lot more out there that you can look at. Jonas is another guy who's big into this, and so that's really a run mechanics. And then we're looking at specific injury avoidance. So specifically looking at the hamstring. So we know 23% was shown in that study to be a massive number in terms of the greatest injury risk that we have. How can we avoid injury? So the day before sessions, heavy hamstring-based gym work the night prior to training. That's not clever. If you're looking to go and really train well, you need your hamstrings not suffering from some sort of DOMS and not being fatigued going into a session. That's a maximal effort in a session a lot of the time. So you've got to be able to basically execute that. And giving yourself a heavy gym session the night before is not a clever way of going about your business. And as I said, we're looking to work up to max sprints. You're not looking to jump in straight away and do it. You know, your warm-up will come into that. You're looking to minimize your risk by, you know, the day before not having that neuromuscular demand on the hamstrings. The max sprint is a big enough neuromuscular demand on it already. So we've got to really give the athlete the best chance of getting through these max efforts by, you know, training up to a max sprint effort through your actual session, whether that's at the end of a warm-up or just slightly further into your session. Or you've got to look at, you know, I suppose the strategies of in the day before or whatever else. And then obviously the recovery post-session. As I said, the neuromuscular demand of max effort sprinting is quite big, and you'll often hear lads talking about, oh, gee, I didn't feel that that session was a big session yesterday, yet I'm really, really sore. And one of the huge advantages we have, you know, in inter-county setups is that we've live GPS on the sideline where we can really gear our athletes through their sprinting, so we can take them up through the gears a little bit, and that's a big thing in terms of making sure we're not overcooking them too early. And then we talked about the regular exposure to sprinting with variation, and what I mean by that, and this is a key point as well, the variation is not just straight line sprinting. We know different demands are placed in the hamstrings when we curve run. We know different demands are placed in the hamstring when we're sprinting and changing direction quickly. And all of these things, you know, are basically, you know, asking our hamstring to produce force, and, you know, we've got to be exposing athletes to all the varying factors of that, or varying components of that. And as I said, I will be definitely avoiding end of session sprinting until sufficient conditioning has been achieved. Therefore, the next number of weeks looking for max effort sprinting, or, you know, even if we look at the COVID period as a whole, you're going to be doing well to get your athletes that sufficient bandwidth to be able to go after end of session fatigue sprinting without decent risk. I guess coming up towards the end of your pre-season stroke, you know, just before you're really starting to gear in the championship, if you have guys up to that level by that stage, then you're in business. But it's going to be tough at this time point of the year to do that. And then obviously hamstring strength work can start literally tonight. So we've a variety of different ways we can train our hamstrings in terms of multi-joint, in terms of isometric, eccentric, concentric, whatever you want. Rate of force development, we can do work on all of those. Here's just a couple of examples of exercises that, you know, we use to, you know, train our athletes. You know, obviously something like a split deadlift or a deadlift is an excellent exercise. Coming into the bottom right there, you've got some lovely run mechanics. And a key component that you just saw me do there in that running mechanics exercise was lumbopelvic control. So lumbopelvic control has been shown to basically, so that little tip I did of my pelvis. So you see a lot of guys in GA, we call it the old duck ass, you know, their ass is sticking out the back and the chest is cocked up, you know, and you think he's the cocky corner forward. Well, actually, sometimes these guys have trained themselves into that position by poor technique on deadlift with an overextension of the spine, or, you know, through various other exercises in the gym or otherwise, or through poor running mechanics. So what happens with the hamstring in that instance is the hamstring attachment and below the knee and the hamstring attachment at your hip is basically, or at your pelvis is basically, the distance is increased, which obviously puts us more at risk. You've got poor running mechanics on top of that. Then you're going to obviously have a bigger stretch in that again, and that leads to obviously hamstring issues. So running mechanics again forms a massive part of any hamstring rehabilitation. And you can see me in the top right there. Again, I clicked in there with the lumbopelvic control, huge part of it. And as I said before, like, I don't have it here. It's, you know, Nordics have got a lot of press in the last number of years as an exercise. That's the exercise where basically you're on your knees, someone holds your ankles and you fall forward. But there are definitely other ways that we can train our hamstring. And in fact, I would definitely encourage guys to train their hamstrings in a variety of different ways. The research all points to really positive results in terms of eccentric and Nordics. That exercise top left is an example of that. That's an eccentric. And then we're looking at groin and hip. And I guess specifically looking at that, early doors, we're going to avoid very small-sided gains, especially as training returns. We're going to include multi-directional running early on. We're going to get that started even already. You know, you can get your athletes out in their ones and basically getting them working on some of this work. And muscle recovery is vital post these sessions. And I think that's really important, especially early doors. Trying to fit 3-4 sessions in a week now in the next number of weeks, you're probably asking for trouble, given that the athletes have done nothing of this type of training in the last number of months. So it's getting guys up to speed at an appropriate rate is going to be really important. And that's the job we have as coaches. And if you're not undertaking that job, you're probably missing a trick, and you're probably going to end up with a few lads on the sideline beside you when it comes around to day one of the club championship. And regular exposure to sprinting with variation, and we talked about that already. And as I said, we're looking at avoiding small shuttle running and small-sided box drills on a regular basis and on return to play. I guess what I mean by that is the really tight drills, and you're definitely, of course, you can do them drills. Funny enough, lads are more exposed to this in terms of injury risk around the hip and groin than ladies are. So getting on top of that with your men's teams is probably more important than with the ladies teams based on the injury profiles that we would see in clinic. So lads definitely need to be really minded in terms of that. But at the same time, absolutely go for your small-sided box drills, but have them well spaced out. The shuttle runs, personally, I think there's probably ways of getting your fitness work done a little bit more game-based. And again, it just takes a bit of creativity to get on top of that. And then I suppose with the at-risk players, so in any squad, you know, ladies football, camogie, lads football and lads hurling, you know, there's going to be at-risk players. especially as we go into senior and onwards. Even sometimes, unfortunately, we're seeing it a little bit younger now in terms of these hip and groin issues. And I think we've got to be really, really careful about how we go about our business in terms of looking after these at-risk players. These players are a very distinct group, and they need to be treated accordingly. We know, we see it already in terms of the increased, I suppose, press attention on hip and groin injuries and what happens maybe in later life, etc. Training is definitely going to be a part of this, so we can, as coaches, limit, I suppose, the impact of that later on with at-risk players. And by at-risk, I mean guys who maybe have had hip and groin issues in the past. So these guys going back in and maybe doing these very small-sided games is probably not a wise idea. And there's probably alternate training that we can look at them doing, even amongst the group, even in the session. It doesn't have to be, all working together in that little small-sided box. There's other ways of working around the ground that you can help these athletes out massively to prolong their careers. And that's also very similar with other issues as well, in terms of hip and groin, in terms of knee, and in terms of ankle. So these are just an example of a couple of different, I suppose, hip exercises that we would use, basically as either strengthening exercises or as, lumbopelvic control exercises. And the top right, the top left is there. Obviously, that's what we call an adductor bridge, a Copenhagen adductor eccentric load lowering bridge. So that there's some research which have also popped on Twitter there that shows that these are really good exercises to undertake in terms of over a long period of time. I wouldn't necessarily recommend getting stuck into this in the short term, because we're not going to end up in a situation where we're going to help the athlete out, especially if they're doing a lot of small-sided stuff. It's probably something to implement over that's a long-term plan, I guess, over the next number of months and years, rather than over the next, let's get this done over the next 3-4 weeks. And likewise, some of the other exercises, bottom left is a hip flexor exercise. We know the hip flexor group is a massive group in terms of controlling that hip joint, and really, really important group in terms of preventing hip and groin injuries. The bottom right is a step up with rotation, where we're asking that right hip to really work hard to hold position, lovely lumbopelvic control, and getting the upper body moving off that. So that's basically asking our hip to work really hard to stabilize, and then the upper body is working. And obviously, we're starting to work a little bit on multi-directional running mechanics in that flip on the top right. And then looking at specific injury avoidance, ankle and knee. Well, I think I've already given you the answer to this, because a lot of the drills that we see in the warm-up section are going to come and basically cover your bases on this. Running mechanics, landing mechanics, huge, especially around the knee. If you're implementing any program in terms of this with your adolescent athlete, you're giving them a great start. Really making sure that we're looking for that nice solid land, no knee valgus, and what I mean by knee valgus is your knee coming across your body as you land. So that kind of knee wobble, really, really important that we're looking to get rid of that. And obviously we're looking at no foot turned out to the side or no body sway to either side. So landing mechanics is quite a big one to really get working on. ACL injury is obviously massive at that. Likewise, multi-directional mechanics. So how to cut properly, how to change direction properly, how to get our body leaning into the corner rather than what we call, the motorbike crash scenario, where a lad's going into a corner or a girl's going into a corner and she throws the head out over the corner and then comes back, putting massive strain, massive load, massive force through your hip and groin, when we could have a nice body lean pushing out of that corner to bring ourselves along. So multi-direction mechanics, all these mechanics drills are just, they're sitting there waiting for you in the warm-ups, really important. And obviously reactive strength. So that's a massive part of our game as well, the ability to really generate force quickly, and that's really important, especially for the speed of a game like Gaelic football, camogie or hurling. And then we're looking at that specific muscle control around the quad, around the calf, really important. There's so much load going through our calf muscle group, in just general running, it's 5-7 times body weight, and it keeps going up as you go sprinting. So the big thing with that, with the calf stuff, there's a lot of research in AFL showing us that, guys are presenting with what we call soleus strains, or, lower Achilles type issues, especially soleus strains. the day after. They don't realize that they injured themselves, but they're sore around the bottom of their calf, kind of off the muscly part of their calf. And a lot of the time, they've actually like a low-grade soleus strain. And I guess what we've got to be really careful about at the moment is really making sure our athletes are, ready for going back into sport, because these are the muscles that are probably more at risk from the road running type scenario that we've had over the last number of months. Specifically, there's a couple of good soleus strength exercises that you can catch pretty much anywhere. I have one on my Instagram as well, I think. And then we're into recovery. And then looking at a recovery, so there's obviously loads of modalities. There's a 300-page paper I was reading through only last night, and all of these come into it: sleep, hydration, recovery, cardio, that's gentle cycling or whatever else, compression garments, nutrition, post-game massage, contrast bath, water submersion, right? So there's a variety of different kind of research or recovery modalities that we can look at in the research. And I guess there's no massive, standout one that, this is the one you should be doing. But we do know that all of these add to the mix, especially, I suppose, around that sleep, hydration, nutrition area, where we know that there's a lot more research coming out in more recent years, which is great, because like getting nutrition, especially in this time period now where we might have quick turnarounds in terms of either dual players, or where we've got quick turnarounds in terms of week on week in terms of championship, it's really important that we look at our athletes and get that nutrition and hydration and getting that cellular level recovery going as quickly as possible. And obviously there's loads of stuff on sleep out there. Michelle Biggins has some great stuff on sleep, that shows the benefits of that in terms of recovery processes. And I guess if we're not getting that recovery, this is an interesting slide in terms of what we actually expect to happen with training. So on the left-hand side, you can see we train, we're getting that reduced capacity, we recover, and then over time we're getting this super compensation and increased capacity. But if we don't get adequate recovery, if we're not getting that time period between training sessions, this is what's happening. And essentially this is, your training is basically followed by short periods of recovery, followed by training, followed by short periods of recovery, and we're never getting that, I suppose, super compensation. So it's really important that we look at recovery as being a huge part of a given week, and planning for a recovery as much as we're planning for our sessions, and making sure the lads are getting that recovery and they're not bringing in extras, or the girls are doing an extra HIIT class a week, or they're doing an extra 5K run a week. You've got to get away from that now coming into championship time period, and really take control of your performance going into which is going to be a very short period. So in conclusion, so if we're looking at the coming weeks, we're looking at incremental loading with variability of load, or variability of movement, and obviously loading quite slowly through that at the start, and then obviously coming up a little bit quicker as we go along, keeping it nice and consistent as much as possible. The GA15 activate warm-ups reduce injury by 35 to 50%. That's a massive research to have in your back burner when say another coach might say to you, well, why are you doing that? This is, we've got the answers right here in the research, and it's huge research from a variety of different sources around the world. And sprint quickly, wisely. This is a really important one. So I guess we're coming back into using the speed vaccine analogy. So if we're looking at speed as being a preventative, effect on injury, especially around the hamstring, we've got to get that sprint training into our athletes on a regular basis. And then obviously with small-sided gains, we're monitoring pitch size, player numbers, and knowing their interaction. We know what we're going to get out of that bigger pitch with smaller numbers. We know what we're going to get out of that smaller pitch with bigger numbers. We know what we're going to get in between in terms of the intensity, etc. And it's really important that we use, I suppose, all of these components within our sessions, but making sure that we're given adequate time for the athlete to get over whatever stimulus you've given them. And then obviously we talked about the recovery pre and post sessions and how that will impact on performance and potentially availability. And that's key. So that time period where we're going to have short gains, short time periods between gains is going to be very, very important. And those guys that get that recovery in and get, maximize that time period are going to be the guys that are going to be ready for the next game quicker, going to be ready for the next training session quicker, which is obviously, again, coming into that, I suppose, performance enhancing period of the season where we want to be able to train hard and we want to be able to recover well in order to get the benefits of that. So that's pretty much it really for me. If there's any questions, obviously I'll be happy to answer them here. As I said, I put up a couple of resources there on Twitter that you can take a look at. We also have on our Instagram account there, you can take a look at it. We've got some, obviously exercise, and we're continuously adding to that in terms of variety of exercises. So thanks for listening, everyone, and please God, everyone gets a good pre-season in, and hopefully we get some football and hurling and camogie this year and really get back to what we love, which is coaching and playing, obviously.
Eamon, thanks a million for that presentation. A fantastic volume of work and activity, and some really good detail. Some of the really specific injuries that players might engage with or might encounter over the next number of weeks. First of all, apologies to people watching on for the slight hiccup with some of the slides earlier on, but I think we got that more or less sorted as we were going through. Some questions have come through. Just, I suppose, for everybody's sake, people who have put through questions about specific injuries maybe are not really necessarily appropriate for this, because obviously Eamon is not able to do an assessment of an individual or a player. So I think largely in that case, if you have an injury or an illness or a doubt over something, it's seek the appropriate medical treatment yourself rather than asking Eamon to deal with it right now. So that's maybe the first thing. So if you have put forward a question like that and we don't get to it, that's why we're not going to cover things like that. One of the things, Eamon, that strikes me in the current COVID situation for lots of teams outside of intercounty level, when things close down there in mid-March or so, teams might only be in the middle of a pre-season in lots of counties, because their county leagues mightn't have started up till later March or even sometimes into April. So I'm thinking that lots of players mightn't actually have had a proper game for almost going back to September, October last year. So it's really going to be a very intense, or potentially a very intense period for those type of guys.
Definitely, yeah. Like in terms of that, I guess, when we look at game speed is incredibly quick, and the only way you can really train game speed is by being involved in games. Unfortunately, it looks like our ability to actually undertake that type of, challenge game or, that type of approach this year is going to be severely, weakened. But I guess the only thing is everyone's going to be in the same boat. Yes, that will probably leave us more, exposed to injury, and we saw a little bit of that over the last couple of weeks in the Bundesliga. I think that like 7 or 8 muscle injuries in the first weekend alone, and I guess those guys are in the same boat. They're basically coming back off, probably shorter time period, for 7 or 8 weeks, where you would think that a pro athlete would be less conditioned, but they were still picking up these injuries. And if you look at the situation where, the psychological mindset of a lot of people at the moment is, we're not going to see any football this year. We're not going to see any camogie this year. We're not going to see any ladies football, whatever. That mindset is grand until suddenly things start getting better, and all of a sudden we're into the cuts and thrusts of championship action. So, like, you've got to prepare your athletes as a coach to play and to perform on the first given week to come back to action. And I guess there's probably going to have to be a mindset shift. And I think over the next number of weeks, when we see other sports come back to play, like even the FAI are looking at a small tournament in the next couple of weeks, that I think athletes will start coming around to this a little bit more. And then it's down to the coaches to try and get as much of that as best they possibly can, that game speed type training into their actual, training sessions in order to prepare athletes. It's going to be difficult, there's no doubt about that. But I guess with a good plan, you can probably maybe get some stuff going on within your own setup. It's hard to know if challenge matches, etc., will be allowed. Obviously that would be advantageous. Normally we'd have a couple of league matches here in Dublin, before you get into the championship action. This year there was one, but there's a huge gap, so it's all gone now. In Cavan, for instance, we had we had a league start in April, or meant to have a league start in April, so the lads done nothing down there yet. Some teams were barely back pre-season, but when this all kicked off, so it's certainly going to be really difficult.
And what would you give advice then around training surfaces? Like you said, lots of people are hitting the roads at the moment, which can be fairly unforgiving on the joints, or maybe in public parks and so on. And then when we get back, you might have, you know, pitches which may not have been fantastically maintained over the last number of weeks because it wasn't possible, or even artificial grass pitches. So what sort of advice would you give on surface?
Yeah, so I guess the harder the surface, the harder it is going to be on the joints. So if you're going into that type of surface, you're probably going to see a lot more kind of force going through the various joints in your body. Therefore, increasing that again by throwing in a load of multi-directional work straight away is probably not going to help you out. I suppose your exposure time-wise on the pitch could also be an example of ways of kind of decreasing your injury risk profile. And so if you spend less time, if you're going out for 2 hours, for instance, the first night out, because by God, we missed this, so we better get out and do it, that's probably going to lead to issues. So, we talk about, the RP and time giving you your units, your arbitrary units or whatever else. So looking at that type of thing, there's better speakers out there than me on that in terms of looking at how you manage load in that way is going to be absolutely massive. But one thing I will say is you have got to prepare your athlete for game day one. That has to be the end goal. How you get there, has to be ramping all the time. And I guess the quicker you ramp, the more risk you have of creating an injury for an individual.
And I think regardless of what happens when we start back, after the first training session, it's extremely likely you're going to have players tired, stiff and sore. And is there something that can be done as regards to warm down, and what maybe specific recovery advice or even timing schedules would you look at for that type of situation?
Yeah, well, like if you're looking at the first couple again, so in terms of the warm down specifically, from what I've read anyway, a lot of the research is pointing away from that as being a really useful kind of modality. Your static stretch and post has been really useful. A lot of the research is going back to that recovery slide I showed earlier on in terms of nutrition, in terms of hydration, in terms of sleep, etc. And I guess especially in that initial time period, if you're looking at your athlete on say Tuesday night, which we'd all love to be out there, lovely evening like tonight, and then you're looking for them to go again on Thursday night, that's a very short time period after being out for so long. So maybe giving them the extra day or so, and that could actually be of huge benefit to an athlete. You could see a big increase in terms of their ability to get out of that kind of that kind of a training effect from the session, the kind of micro trauma that would have been caused by that session. So I think that's probably a big thing to look out for, to make sure that you're given adequate recovery, especially at the start. And that's probably distance between sessions to an extent, because we're all going to be massively keen to get back at it. But if you're looking with a little bit of a wider lens and a bit of a longer lens, you can see down the track how going 3 times the first week, you could pay for that in a couple of weeks' time, like.
Yeah, and Des Ryan mentioned that on his discussion last week as well, a couple of times, about how week 1 might only be 1 session, for example, and progressive overload is one of those fundamental canons of sports science that everyone learned about day 1. So it really seems to be something that we need to put in a specific emphasis on.
100%, and you hit the nail on the head there. It's progressive overload, and it's so hard to get that right in terms of that ramp up. But if you're starting with that end in mind and working your way back, you can kind of see what that should look like. And then, but I totally agree with what Des said in terms of really that first week you've got to be so careful. Like the first 2 weeks of preseason, any year you're looking at this and you're going, as a physio, you've got your hands on your head. You're going, we've got to try and put the reins on this somehow to try and keep lads available for the coaches to train them through the preseason. Because they're basically coming from nowhere. You don't know what's happened with some guys are obviously fantastic condition. Some girls are in fantastic condition, but there's some guys that have been watching a hell of a lot of Netflix and The Last Dance over the last number of weeks as well. So there's two sides to it.
Absolutely. And a question here from Brendan. During the lockdown, is the Gaelic 15 or the Activate program something that players could be doing, in their back garden or in the local park just on their own?
Like, one of the points that I would put across with the Gaelic, the GA 15 and the Activate warm-up, both of those warm-ups are, as I said, they're skills. Therefore, when you're coaching a new skill, I don't know if it's the right way of going about your business, doing it in the back garden on your own, because you could be reinforcing per movement behavior. So therefore, I think you're probably looking at, from a club perspective, I think you're looking at really developing a number of coaches across the club. And as I said to you before, or said during the presentation, I really think it's something that we should have in on the foundation level, foundation level modules in terms of our coaching, that coaches are able to see this in action, or maybe not the foundation, maybe the level 1 or something, that they see what good movement looks like. What does a good land look like? What does a good cut look like? What does going about your own business in the back garden, and you can be seeing all sorts. Like, even when I was training the minors here in Bowden last year, and you nearly have to be on the lads the whole time to ensure a good technique. And even at that, they'll always drift off, and you're having to get back on the case with them. But what we know about these types of warm-ups is that if you're doing them over a prolonged period of time, then the athletes are getting the benefits of that, and the research is overwhelming in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, just for people's attention, there are videos of the Gaelic 15 and the Activate activities on both the GA Learning site and also the Ulster Council sites as well. So if you want more information on each of those things, they are available there. Again, one of the things that strikes me at the moment is that when we do get back on pitch, players will be extremely anxious to play. And maybe one of the roles that coaches and strength and conditioning coaches and various people involved with teams will be almost holding people back for their own benefit. And even at the moment, do you see benefit, or what advice would you give to coaches whose players are, trying to do a lot of work at the moment, whether that be 5Ks in the park or running out the road? So what advice would you give coaches on those type of things?
Yeah, well, you're dead right. Like, players are caged animals at the moment. They're only dying to get back at it. In terms of that, education is probably the best bit about that. But you've also got control a little bit in terms of what, if you're, I'm not saying you're prescriptive, but you're certainly setting out what the session looks like. And if you're coming back to this period now, so starting from now, as I said earlier on the presentation, and you're looking at maybe taking somewhat control of what's going on in terms of the individual training that guys are at, you can kind of pull it in a little bit and pull the reins in a little bit. But I think good athletes will realize that, or guys that have been around the block a while, or guys that have had previous injuries, or girls obviously as well, that they will see that basically that there's no benefit to going hell for leather, because more than likely they've had an experience before where that's not worked out, in terms of pre-season or whatever. So it's important that, I suppose, you educate them and then maybe help them along the line in terms of, what does a good program look like when we're individual training. And then obviously in the small groups, then as a coach, you're definitely going to have more control over what's happening. And
for those coaches maybe that haven't been that engaged with their teams over the last little while, it's probably a good idea to be able to get some sort of a picture of what the players have been doing. Like you said, if you've been watching Netflix 10 hours a day as opposed to a guy who might have been trying to do a bit of training here and there.
Key, absolutely key. The first guys I'd be getting in touch with if I was a coach right now is those guys who had injuries coming into lockdown. So those are the research from the NFL lockdown is telling us that they're the guys that were recurring in terms of injuries later on in the season. They're the ones that's my first pot of guys that I'm going after. My second pot of guys or girls that I'm going after will be maybe the people in your club that maybe mightn't exactly be the best trainers in the world, and maybe need a little bit of guidance in that regard. They'd be probably the next batch. And then there's obviously a batch of guys, and we're lucky here, we have a huge batch of them that they're on it, and they know what is happening in terms of training, and they know how to train their bodies, and they're actively looking for that information, which is great.
Yeah, I'm sort of we usually sort of try and finish up these sessions by asking the presenter to give some resources or materials that people are able to access for themselves and have a look at. So I'm obviously conscious that that in the physical area, maybe a little information can sometimes be a bad thing, but are there places that people could go to for good reputable information?
Yeah, well, I suppose it's such a wide field. It's such a wide field, and I wouldn't want to send any coaches down into research or whatever else. To be totally honest, the GA Learning Portal is absolutely superb, and I don't think you're going to run out of information inside in that portal as a coach at the moment. So that's probably where I direct guys, and the first place I would direct a coach is to the 2 warm-ups we discussed, and particularly getting stuck into that and really looking at what that entails. There's some brilliant research from the States on ACL injuries and adolescent girls, and it's deep. They're 6 times more likely to pick up an injury, or 7 times more likely to pick up an injury, which is huge numbers in terms of their risk attached to that. But that research is probably, we're getting a bit too deep for, say, a coach to be going looking at that. I just think you keep it basic in terms of what you're doing, and know about, say, some of the stuff that was spoken about over the last number of weeks in terms of how to map out small-sided games. The Shane Magan stuff that was on there a few weeks back, or obviously there's the speed stuff we're after discussing today. Shane Malone's an excellent resource in that regard. Those guys are both based in TUD Tala, so there's two good resources right there.
Okay, Eamon, thanks very much. We're way over time, but I don't think anyone's complaining. I want to say thanks very much for everything you've put in over the last number of weeks in putting together this session. It's been really informative, and I think that if we can get some light at the end of the tunnel and get some definitive plans for when things will be back, that coaches can get some really positive things from this session. So thanks very much for putting that together.
Thanks for having me.
For all the participants on the call, and we had over 760 tonight, just a couple of announcements. First of all, some of you will see that we launched our Gaelic Games coach survey today. So that's a really big piece of work that we're doing across all the Gaelic Games codes. There are details of it on the GA website and also on the GA Learning website. So we're really interested in the feedback that we can get from coaches about your coaching practice and experience and what your coaching needs are. And also from a coach education perspective, what you need and what you would like us to be trying to provide for you. So we have a fairly ambitious target of what we want to try and achieve to that study, and we've had a really good take-up of it today. So if you do get a chance, it's only about 15 minutes. It shouldn't even take 15 minutes for lots of people. But if you get a chance to contribute to that study, we'd really appreciate it. One of these sessions, maybe in the next number of weeks, we'll dedicate to some of the findings that we get from that study. So if you do come across that, please share it amongst your coaching groups with coaches in your club or school. And if you can contribute, that would be really helpful for us all. We continue this session on Thursday, and we have a session with Dr. Anya McNamara, who has just recently took up a position in Dublin City University after being based in the UK for the last number of years. Even though she was living in Ireland, so she knows all about these webinar sessions. And James Devan, who's Games Development Manager in Leinster, and they're going to talk about the Tourist program, which is a coach development program that they've been running in Leinster over the last couple of years. That's really strong evidence-based program, especially for the younger players and teenage players in our system. So the registration for that is open now. It opened there about 30 minutes ago at 8:30. So registration is open now, and that will take place on Thursday next at 7:30 back here. So hopefully we'll see you all back here again on Thursday. Thanks again to Eamon and everyone, for Kevin Leahy in the Player Welfare Department here in Croke Park for facilitating this as well. And we really appreciate all of your time. So thanks very much and good night.